Hello, my name's Chris Allen. I'm based at the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester. And today my paper is going to be looking at whether the British far right are human rights advocates or human rights opportunists. And I'll be doing that through looking through the lens of defence discourses. So just to begin, defence discourses is a concept that I kind of come up with in myself. And it's about this idea of the way in which sort of the British, or some within the British far right milieu, have begun to use this kind of discourses around needing to defend Britain. This idea that Britain needs to defend in protection against or resistance against certain entities which is trying to destroy it. And so, so this is something which I've seen over the last, this can be traced back historically, but this is something which has become much more kind of prominent in the last couple of decades. And as it says there, what we see is that there's a defence or a resistance to something that's perceived to be destroying Britain or has the potential to destroy Britain, or it stands for. But at the same time, you also within these discourses as well have a sense of who is to blame for this as well. And as part of that, what you can see there is that, and this is just an indicative list, is that sometimes it's mainstream politicians, sometimes it's anti-fascists, cultural Marxists, the media, political correctness. The list goes on in terms of that. And it resonates there, very much in terms of this idea around sort of populism, around, them being the people being against the elites. So that's something which really kind of comes in there. So when I talk about defence discourses throughout this paper, that's what I'm kind of referring to in terms of that. But hopefully that'll come a little bit more clearer as we move on. Now, of course, these kind of ideas of the far right, being kind of and defending against something, a bulwark against change, has been something which we can trace back historically. I mean, we can go back and look at the White Defence League in the 1960s. You can look at the National Front in the 70s and 80s. These are kind of themes which have been coming through in their kind of in their discursive kind of their discursive ideologies. But one of the things that I've really seen within the last kind of 2 decades has been this kind of idea that actually these defence discourses are used as a way to bring about a mainstream, kind of mainstreaming agenda, to try and change perceptions of what the far right is or what the far right was, to demarcate the difference between the far right today and the far right, what it was historically. And I think that that's something that we've kind of seen, particularly since the turn of the century. And I've got a quote there from Nigel Copsey and Nigel Copsey's work. And as it says there, the far right locate itself within broader oppositional culture towards the politics of multiculturalism, a culture in which organisations like the BNP, the British National Party, appeared less extreme than they did prior to 2001. So I think that this is a junction where we can see this. Is that this first began around this idea of being against multiculturalism. So it wasn't that like with the National Front, that they were that they were a racist organisation. It wasn't that these were against like kind of white supremacy or anything that we've seen in some of those previous groups. But this was very much about making a stand against a particular kind of concept or idea, and around this idea that Britain was multicultural and that Britain's multicultural would actually threaten Britain as it is known. And so it says that in doing so, Britain's extreme right was able to construct some semblance of legitimacy, particularly so at a local level. So Copsey's recognising there the fact that actually what this did was not only did it offer a kind of mainstreaming element to it, not only did it try to bring kind of some legitimacy in there, but also it began to speak to people in deprived areas, people who were living in deprivation, and kind of begin to start scapegoating multiculturalism and those who are behind multiculturalism, i.e. the politicians that have allowed this to occur. And actually that way you can kind of deflect away from being seen to be racist, Islamophobic and so on. And so, that's really the kind of junction where we've begun to see this. Now, including my own research and the research of others here, what we've seen is that over particularly the last 10 years as well, that these defence discourses have changed. They change and transform. They respond to different socio-political entities as time goes on. And I think that what we saw there, Hilary Pilkinson's their work, she talks about the EDL, the English Defence League, and she says that they utilise discourses around the need to protect or defend women, girls, and LGBT communities, as a way of kind of like sort of insisting that the threat posed by radical Islam was actually something that we needed to be, aware of. That it was the far right who were brave enough to actually speak up and say this. That it was far right who were taking, in some ways, the high moral ground and saying, well, look, we are going to be protecting our women, our girls, our LGBT communities. Now, obviously, the latter of those, the LGBT communities, is something that, the far right in Britain has historically never embraced. But we saw this with the English Defence League, this idea around different divisions and the idea that there was a disabled division, a Jewish division, a Sikh division, and the women's division, which was called the Ideal Angels. And then, of course, we had the LGBT division as well. So this was really about kind of, not only was it around a defensive discourse or a defence discourse, but it was also about using those defence discourse to reach out to different constituencies and also to try and paint a different picture of what exactly it was. And so then we go on and we see Britain First, and this was from my own research, and Britain First, its own strapline, its own way it defended itself was that it provided the frontline resistance towards the perceived Islamification of Britain. So again, the defence discourse of Britain First was actually in the way it described itself, and of course that was something that kind of went on and continued, and was something which became very apparent in terms of that. And then we have the image on the right hand side, and the final bullet point there, and the infidel network, the Northwest Infidels is there. Not only does it say fighting for white rights, but it also says there again this idea around protection, around a defence discourse, around the need to kind of defend against rape refugees. A portmanteau there of kind of rape and refugee, and this idea that not only does it communicate the threat, who the infidels say they need to kind of defend against, but it also identifies the perpetrators at the same time. And so this is something that we've seen right the way throughout. This is something we've seen over the past 10 years, and this is something which has been under some sort of transformation. So we can see quite a bit in terms of that, in terms of where we're going as well. In terms of that change and development. So, in terms of my own research around the Football Lads Alliance and Democratic Football Lads Alliance, one of the things that I said that was becoming evident within this was this idea of a move towards a progressive agenda via the defence of free speech. And I think that it's this where we kind of get into this area around kind of human rights and civil rights, and you see that, with the Football Lads Alliance and the FLA and DFLA, the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, what you see with both of them is the emergence and the kind of beginning prominence of a defence discourse around freedom of speech. So you have here this idea that actually sort of the DFLA in particular are insistent on protecting our free speech. And obviously, I use our in speech marks in terms of that. But what you have here is a very, very clear element where you have this very strong identity of the DFLA of providing a defence. So their defence discourses focus on free speech, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of thought. So very much position it within those kind of human rights kind of framework. And of course, this is Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's similarly enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights, and it's also in British legislation and the Human Rights Act 1998 as well. So this is something which is not something which resonates with a liberal society. This is not something that doesn't resonate with a democratic society. This is something which is reaching out and speaking to a completely different audience as maybe the far right has done in previous times, and particularly in the British setting as well. And so this is why I was talking about this idea of a progressive agenda. This idea that actually sort of these defence discourses, it's no longer about multiculturalism when it is in alternative, but the prominency. We've had women, we've had LGBT communities, we've had Islamification and so on, and now we're in this space where those defence discourses of the far right are about freedom of speech. And we can look at a couple of newer, much smaller groups, that have emerged in recent years, and probably even only this year in terms of Patriotic Alternative. And Patriotic Alternative on their website, they have a 20-point plan to rebuild Britain. And as it says there, freedom of speech will be enshrined for all British citizens. Now, it's open to question whether they will actually extend that to all British citizens, or all British citizens of a certain ethnicity or a certain racial hue, shall we say. But that's their point. Freedom of speech is there. The Liberty Defenders, their tagline is because civil rights are for everyone. Again, questionable in terms of their ideology. But they set out a Bill of Rights for Britain on their website. And in Article 1, Parliament shall make no law infringing upon the freedom of speech, the will of the people to peaceably assemble or protest. Free speech is to be protected, whether uttered, written, or disseminated online. Organisations with a monopoly on the platform's use of personal expression will have to guarantee the rights of all users in order to champion said freedom of expression. So that's a very unequivocal statement there. It's that this is freedom of speech is the most important thing for liberty defenders. It's part of the enshrined guarantees that the patriotic alternative will put in place once they get through all of the UK. And as I say, Football Lads Alliance, FLA, DFLA, both again, their defence discourses, fitting in to that kind of space. And what we have in this is why I refer to it as a progressive agenda. It's a progressive agenda where people are moving into, the far right are moving into a kind of different, series of mainstreaming, and that is through human rights and civil rights agendas. So really, I guess that this kind of really began to take shape in 2017, and this was on the back of two incidents. First was a former leader of the English Defence League, EDL, and former leader of Pegida UK, and well-known kind of far-right activist, Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, and he was banned from Twitter after tweeting that Islam promotes killing people. And you have the image on the left-hand side there: freedom, free speech, hashtag free Tommy. These were his supporters. The second relates to the image on the second side, on the right-hand side, sorry, and that was around Jada Francis and Paul Golding from Britain First, who were jailed for a series of hate crimes against Muslims, some of which included screaming paedophile at kind of innocent random Muslims in a shop, shouting Islamophobic abuse, and also filming that and uploading that onto their website. And I want to just read, what was said in the prosecution of President Golding. And the judge said these defendants were not merely exercising their rights for free speech, but were instead aiming religiously aggravating abuse at innocent members of the public. And of course, this is where the problem lies with freedom of speech, is because what the freedom of speech that these groups are championing and becoming advocates of is the freedom of speech that actually isn't conducive to a multicultural society, isn't conducive to a society where there is diversity. And so what we saw again then with this was we saw that there was a response to this. We had this kind of event which was kind of set up on March the 18th in Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park, and we had people coming from, we had initially it was meant to be Martin Sellner from the alt-right group Generation Identity, but instead we had like Lutz Bachmann, the original founder of the German Pegida. So we're seeing these kind of individuals come through here. There was also a much bigger event which was organised on May the 6th, 2017, which was called Day for Freedom. And we can see this here. On the left-hand side, you have there a DFLA, Democratic Football Lads Alliance, kind of like flyer. And it says they're defending our nation's basic human rights to freedom of speech. On the right-hand side, you have an image there. And if you look, it says justice for women and children. So what we have here again is this kind of idea that actually this was coming through. Now, of course, on one level, we're talking about human rights advocacy. We're talking about kind of like, are they, protecting or defending human rights for, as it says on the left-hand side, for our nation, defending human rights for our nation, actually for all of us. But when you actually look at the people that attended and spoke at that event, we had Gerard Batten, the leader of the UK Independence Party at the time, the Proud Boys founder from the US, Gary McInnes, the YouTube personality, I'm not quite sure that's the right phrase, Sargon of Akkad, and Anne-Marie Waters from the For Britain political party as well. So there was definitely a political and ideological hue or tinge which ran through all of those individuals. And of course, what we see there is that rights is, maybe not as straightforward as we would like to believe, or not as straightforward as the far right would like us to believe. So, what we have here is we can see that actually, in reality, is that we have a loophole which is being kind of exploited here with impunity. These are being these events, these demonstrations, these defense discourses of the far right are actually talking about championing sort of kind of human and civil rights and civil liberties. Is about championing all of this for all of us, but actually underlying this is not actually so true. But what you get with this is this idea that actually there is potential here to appeal to a much wider audience. There is potential here to say we are not the far right that was what we were 20, 30 years ago. We are not that same kind of movement or organisation in terms of that. And so what we see underneath this is this idea that actually sort of it's a very old old, maybe 20 years or so, it's a very much a kind of ideology which underpins this, which when we scratch the surface, when we begin to deconstruct what these defence discourses are, we see that not a lot has actually changed in terms of, those defence discourses. Yes, the focus of those defence discourses have changed. Yes, the focus has changed and shifted and transformed, and the discourses themselves have transformed. But actually, the underlying kind of justification for those is very much similar to defence discourses which began to emerge 20 years ago. And to do that, we need to look at this idea around invasion or Islamification. And so one of the ideas, the frontline resistance against Islamification, as Britain first put it, was this idea that actually Muslims and by consequence the religion of Islam are seeking to take over this country. They're seeking to take over Britain. Of course, if you go onto European mainland, if you look more broadly, these are very much the same kind of sort of movement, the same ideas, the same argument. The theory of the Great Replacement, for example, very much fits in with this idea that Muslims are kind of taking over and taking over from the inside. And this is achieved through ongoing immigration, high birth rate, influence in national, local, and regional politics and policies, and through that, imposing Islamic values. And one of the great examples that they show that the far right will use will be this idea that actually halal meat is being sold in our stores and it's not labelled properly. This idea that actually these things are taking over, they're taking over from the inside, and Islamic values are being imposed on us. And so what we have there is that we have this result. When we talk about Islamification, is that what the far right, has argued previously, what Britain first argued, is that they need to stand up for who we are and what we stand for. Because if we don't, or if they don't, there will be this insidious eradication of actually sort of where, what Britain is and what Britain stands for. And so what we have there is this is why, this is actually that, the far right, and these defence discourses around, kind of human rights and civil liberties are actually sort of, they're just opportunism. They are just mere smokescreens behind which established far right ideologies and arguments actually kind of sit. And so the defence discourses are far from neutral. So, they irrespective of what is said, we should see them just as human rights opportunists, But what this does show us as well is that actually sort of Britain's far right, is hugely dynamic and diversifying. These defence discourses give us a way in to being able to understand the way in which that change is moving on, the way in which those things are shaping, the way in which we are actually seeing the change and the difference, and the way in which kind of the far right are seeking to not only mainstream, but also seeking to reach out to different audiences. And we'll take on the language of, liberalism. We'll take on the language of the left. We'll take on, human rights, and civil liberties. We'll take on all of those discourses and the language associated with those as a means of being able to put forward and perpetuate its existing historical ideological viewpoints. And so these defence discourses around kind of human rights and civil liberties, they provide a timely smokescreen. And when you scratch the surface, what you find is those exactly the same older discourses, continue to lurk. They deflect criticism from allegations of racism and Islamophobia. We're not Islamophobic. We're talking about protecting our freedom of speech. We're not racist. We're talking about, protecting human rights for everybody. That's open to question. They present a less extreme face. actually, if you look back at images, or if you're old enough to remember, from the National Front, from White Defence League, you had a much more aggressive, kind of outward face. What you have now, amongst some of the far right milieu, is that you have a much more kind of acceptable, you have a much more public, you have a much more liberal face, which is there. And of course, what they do as well is, is if somebody is protecting human rights, if somebody is protecting a kind of view around, sort of civil liberties, well, it makes sense. It's common sense. Why would we not protect our human rights? Why would we not protect our civil liberties? And in a time when there's more divisions, when a time when there's fears and so on, this is a very, very powerful message. And so understanding these defence discourses is key to our understanding of the far right, but it's also key to our understanding of how we respond to those. I hope you found this paper interesting. I hope that there's something in there that you'd like to kind of explore in more detail. Do please get in touch. Do reach out to me via Twitter at Dr. Chris Allen, at my email address at chris.allen@leicester.ac.uk, or have a look on my website, www.drchrisallen.uk. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.